The Michelle Moore Bosco case, tragically known in the annals of American criminal justice as the saga of the Norfolk Four, stands as one of the most chilling and highly publicized examples of systemic failure, coerced confessions, and prosecutorial tunnel vision in modern legal history. Beginning with the brutal murder of an 18-year-old Navy wife in the summer of 1997 in Norfolk, Virginia, the investigation rapidly spiraled out of control. Over the ensuing months and years, law enforcement extracted a series of shocking confessions from 4 active-duty United States Navy sailors, painting a gruesome, chaotic picture of a coordinated, multi-perpetrator crime. However, as the legal proceedings unfolded, glaring inconsistencies began to emerge. The physical and scientific evidence presented a narrative entirely distinct from the police reports, and a startling revelation from an unrelated prison inmate would eventually upend the entire foundation of the prosecution's case. The case would ultimately require 2 decades of relentless advocacy, the involvement of prominent legal scholars, journalists, and the intervention of multiple Virginia governors to untangle a dark web of falsehoods and restore justice. What follows is the comprehensive, step-by-step narrative of the case, from the idyllic beginnings of a young marriage to the darkest corners of police interrogation rooms, and finally, to the hard-won exoneration of innocent men. A Pittsburgh romance and a Norfolk tragedy. The tragic narrative begins with 2 young high school sweethearts from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 18-year-old Michelle Moore and 19-year-old William Bill Bosco. Bound by youthful optimism and deep affection, the couple married in April of 1997. Seeking to build a stable foundation for their new life together, Bill joined the United States Navy, which led the newlyweds to relocate to Norfolk, Virginia, home to the massive naval station Norfolk. They settled into an apartment in the Bayshore Apartment Gardens complex. In early July 1997, Bill Bosco was deployed for a week at sea aboard the frigate USS Simpson, leaving his new bride at home. On the afternoon of the 8th of July 1997, Bill's ship returned to the pier in Norfolk. Eager to reunite with Michelle, he anticipated meeting her at the docks. When she did not arrive, Bill assumed that a new job she was scheduled to start had prevented her from meeting him, so he took a taxicab back to the Bayshore Apartment Gardens. Upon entering his apartment, Bill called out to his wife, but the home was enveloped in an eerie silence. He searched for a note but found nothing to explain her absence. Deciding to surprise her at her workplace, Bill went into their bedroom to shower and change clothes. It was there, upon striding into the room, that his world collapsed. He discovered Michelle's lifeless body on the bedroom floor. She was clad only in a black t-shirt and was lying in a pool of her own blood. Panic-stricken and desperate, Bill Bosco ran out of his apartment and frantically beat on the door of his neighbor, a fellow Navy sailor named Daniel Williams. Williams immediately called 911. When first responders and the Norfolk Police Department arrived at the horrific scene, the true brutality of the crime became apparent. Michelle Moore Bosco had been raped, severely beaten, strangled, and ultimately stabbed to death. Investigators recovered the murder weapon beneath a chest of drawers. A steak knife taken from the apartment's kitchen, its serrated blade bent at nearly a right angle to its handle due to the sheer force of the assault. The physical evidence at the scene told a very specific forensic story. Michelle died from strangulation and stabbing, with the medical examiner noting 3 penetrating stab wounds clustered tightly in a 2.75-inch by 2-inch area on her left chest. Each wound was exactly 5 inches deep, equidistant apart, and inflicted in the same direction, indicating a rapid, consecutive stabbing pattern by a single assailant. Furthermore, the narrow, 2.5-foot wide hallway leading to the bedroom was entirely undisturbed. Delicately balanced papers and paraphernalia on the hallway shelves remained perfectly intact. There were no signs of a break-in or a massive struggle outside the bedroom itself. The interrogators and the first domino. The investigation was spearheaded by Norfolk police detectives Maureen Evans and Robert Glenn Ford. Detective Ford, the lead investigator, had a controversial history within the department. In 1990, Ford had secured a series of false confessions from 3 teenagers in a robbery and murder case known as the Lafayette Grill case, which led to a brief reassignment before his return to the elite homicide unit. His interrogation tactics would soon become the focal point of the Bosco investigation. The detective's attention quickly zeroed in on Daniel Williams, the neighbor whose door Bill Bosco had knocked on. The suspicion was ignited when Michelle's friend, Tamika Taylor, suggested to police that Williams might have committed the crime because he allegedly harbored a crush on Michelle, although Taylor later claimed she also mentioned another local man, Omar Ballard, as a suspect. Additionally, Williams was in a highly vulnerable emotional state. His wife, Nicole, had recently been diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer, prompting the couple to move their wedding date up to late June 1997, just to ensure she was covered by his Navy health insurance. On the 9th of July, 1997, Williams was brought in for questioning. What followed was an agonizing 11-hour interrogation marathon. Detective Ford utilized high-pressure, coercive techniques heavily reliant on psychological manipulation. Williams was falsely told that he had failed a polygraph test, which he had actually passed, called a liar repeatedly, and threatened with execution specifically, being told he would face the death penalty if he did not confess. Broken by sleep deprivation, extreme duress, and terror, Williams finally succumbed. His initial confession, however, was fundamentally flawed. Williams signed a statement confessing that he had beaten Michelle to death with a shoe. Hours later, when the medical examiner's autopsy results conclusively proved that Michelle was not beaten to death but rather stabbed and strangled, the detectives did not view Williams' blatantly incorrect confession as evidence of his innocence. Instead, Ford confronted Williams with the autopsy facts, prompting Williams to sign a second, revised confession that conveniently matched the new forensic reality, stating he had stabbed her. Armed with this coerced document, police arrested Daniel Williams and charged him with capital murder and rape. The expanding net of coercion. While Daniel Williams languished in jail, his wife Nicole tragically passed away from cancer in November 1997. Shortly thereafter, in December 1997, the Norfolk police received the results of the DNA testing on the biological evidence, blood and semen, recovered from the crime scene. The scientific results were unequivocal. Daniel Williams was conclusively excluded as the contributor of the DNA. However, police and prosecutors withheld this exculpatory evidence from Williams and his defense attorneys for months, finally disclosing it in April 1998. Faced with DNA evidence that completely exonerated their prime suspect, Detective Ford and the Norfolk police did not release Williams. Instead, they developed a new theory. If Williams' DNA wasn't at the scene, he must have had accomplices. The police next targeted Williams' roommate, a fellow Navy sailor named Joseph Dick Jr. Subjected to the same relentless, threatening interrogation tactics, Dick eventually cracked and confessed to participating in the crime alongside Williams. When subsequent DNA testing excluded Joseph Dick as well, the investigators expanded their net even further. They brought in a third sailor, Eric C. Wilson. Like the others, Wilson was subjected to intimidation, threats of the electric chair, and aggressive psychological abuse until he too signed a confession implicating himself, Dick, and Williams. Unsurprisingly, the DNA results excluded Wilson as well. Refusing to accept the mounting scientific proof of their error, the police returned to Williams and Dick, pressuring them to name even more accomplices. Under intense duress, they implicated several other men, including a fourth sailor named Derek Tice. Tice was brought in, interrogated, threatened, and ultimately confessed to being part of a massive group assault. He too was excluded by DNA. In total, the police indicted and pursued charges against 8 different men for the murder, constructing an elaborate and wildly improbable theory that a gang of frenzied sailors had swarmed the small apartment to rape and murder the young woman. Ultimately, the prosecution moved forward against 4 men, Williams, Dick, Wilson, and Tice, who became collectively known as the Norfolk Four, the psychology of false confessions. To the layperson, the idea that 4 distinct individuals would confess to a horrific crime they did not commit seems unfathomable. Yet, the Norfolk Four case serves as a textbook study in the psychology of false confessions. Experts who later analyzed the case identified a perfect storm of coercive interrogation markers: extreme isolation, prolonged sleep deprivation, actual or threatened violence, and the ultimate psychological weapon, the threat of the death penalty. Detectives utilized a manipulative technique whereby they would feed the suspect's crime scene details, either intentionally or inadvertently, until the suspect's narrative vaguely mirrored the official police theory. The sailors, none of whom had prior criminal records, were completely unequipped to handle the psychological warfare waged by experienced interrogators like Ford. Dick, for instance, recalled a detective shoving him into a corner and forcing him to look at gruesome, bloody crime scene photographs of Michelle's body, breaking his mental resolve. Furthermore, the confessions themselves were a mess of contradictions. The accounts provided by Williams, Dick, Wilson, and Tice varied wildly from one another regarding who did what, the sequence of events, and the mechanics of the murder. They were internally inconsistent and entirely incompatible with the physical evidence at the scene. Science versus the state's theory. The sheer absurdity of the state's gang rape theory was continuously disproven by the physical crime scene. The prosecution argued that as many as 8 men had invaded the apartment, forcefully dragged a healthy, resistant 18-year-old woman down a narrow hallway, and engaged in a frenzied group assault. Yet the 2.5-foot-wide hallway showed absolutely no signs of a struggle. Stacks of papers and delicate items resting on shelves along the hall were completely undisturbed. Moreover, the medical examiner's findings regarding the fatal stab wounds, 3 strikes tightly clustered in a 2.75-inch area, penetrating exactly the same depth in the same direction, were the unmistakable signature of a single attacker working quickly and consecutively. Such a precise wound pattern could not possibly have been created by a chaotic mob of excited men passing a single steak knife around in a cramped bedroom while the victim fought for her life. Despite this overwhelming scientific impossibility, and the total lack of any physical evidence, no hair, no fibers, no fingerprints, no DNA linking any of the sailors to the crime scene, the prosecution relentlessly marched forward. The true monster in plain sight. While the Norfolk Four were being broken in interrogation rooms, the actual perpetrator was already known to law enforcement for a string of violent crimes. His name was Omar Ballard. Ballard was an acquaintance of Michelle Moore Bosco and was known to frequent the Bayshore Apartment Gardens complex. His behavioral timeline in the summer of 1997 was a portrait of escalating violence. On the 24th of June 1997, just 2 weeks before Michelle's murder, Ballard attacked a woman named Melissa Morse with a baseball bat in the very same apartment complex. On July 17, 1997, a mere 10 days after Michelle's murder, Ballard brutally beat and raped a 14-year-old girl at knife point, scarcely a mile away from the Bosco residence. The breakthrough in the Bosco case came in February 1999, more than a year and a half after the murder. A woman walked into the Norfolk Police Department bearing a terrifying letter written by an inmate serving time in prison. The inmate was Omar Ballard. In the letter, written to threaten a former girlfriend, Ballard arrogantly bragged about murdering Michelle. The chilling text read, in part, "And one last thing you remember. That night I went to Mommy's house, and the next morning Michelle got killed. Guess who did that? Me, hey, H.A. It wasn't the first time. If I was out, I would have killed that bitch down the street from you too." Confronted with this letter, police obtained biological samples from Ballard and ran them against the crime scene evidence. The forensic laboratory confirmed what the coerced confessions had tried to bury. Omar Ballard's DNA was a definitive match. It was his blood scraped from beneath Michelle's fingernails as she fought for her life, and it was his semen found on her body and the blanket. Ballard confessed to the crime, providing an accurate description of the crime scene that aligned perfectly with the physical evidence, and adamantly insisted that he had acted completely alone. A prosecution defiant, with the true killer identified by irrefutable DNA evidence, and his own uncoerced, highly accurate confession, the logical conclusion would be the immediate release of the Norfolk Four. Instead, the prosecution dug in its heels to protect its convictions. To salvage their crumbling case, prosecutors brokered a controversial plea deal with Ballard. In exchange for the state taking the death penalty off the table, Ballard agreed to alter his confession to falsely implicate Williams, Dick, Wilson, and Tice, claiming he had run into them in the parking lot and joined their assault. Ballard would later recant this, asserting that Detective Ford explicitly told him he would only receive a favorable sentence if he implicated the sailors. Meanwhile, the Norfolk Four faced an agonizing legal dilemma. Terrified by the prosecution's relentless threat of the death penalty, Daniel Williams and Joseph Dick Jr. took plea bargains, pleading guilty to rape and murder to secure life sentences and avoid execution. Dick, entirely broken by the system, was even forced to testify as a state witness against the others in their trials. Eric Wilson and Derek Tice refused to plead guilty and took their cases to a jury trial. During Wilson's trial, the jury was presented with his recorded confession but was also informed that absolutely no physical evidence connected him to the scene and that Ballard's DNA was the sole match. In a baffling split verdict, Wilson was acquitted of the murder charge but found guilty of rape, resulting in an 8.5-year prison sentence. Tice was subsequently tried, found guilty of rape and murder, and sentenced to life in prison. Omar Ballard ultimately pleaded guilty to the crimes in March 2000 and was sentenced to 2 life terms, though he maintained that he was the sole perpetrator. The Norfolk Four were locked away, victims of a justice system that prioritized convictions over truth. The long darkness and the fight for light. For years, the innocent sailors languished in Virginia's prison system. Eric Wilson completed his 8.5-year sentence for a rape he did not commit, but his release offered little freedom. Forced to register as a violent sex offender, he was barred from working in certain areas, forbidden from entering city parks, and had to spend over $10,000 in legal fees just to convince a state board to grant him an electrician's license so he could earn a living. However, behind the scenes, a massive mobilization of legal advocates was forming. The glaring injustices of the Norfolk Four case attracted national attention. Dozens of former FBI agents, retired judges, ex-prosecutors, including former Virginia Attorney General Richard Cullen, and innocence advocacy groups rallied to their cause. Crime novelist John Grisham became a vocal advocate for the men, penning articles and bringing mainstream visibility to their plight. The PBS documentary series Frontline produced a gripping investigative film titled The Confessions, which meticulously laid bare the coercion, the scientific impossibilities, and the corruption of the interrogations. In August 2009, bowing to immense public and legal pressure, Virginia Governor Tim Kaine took action, but it was a compromised half measure. Governor Kaine granted Williams, Dick, and Tice conditional pardons. The pardon reduced their sentences to time served, allowing them to walk out of prison as free men, but it did not vacate their convictions. The men remained convicted felons and were legally required to remain on the restrictive sex offender registry, a haunting stigma that continued to destroy their personal and professional lives. Complete exoneration and reckoning. The Norfolk Four and their legal teams refused to give up, demanding complete exoneration. The turning point arrived in 2016. After exhaustive legal maneuvering, a federal judge reviewed the entirety of the case, the DNA evidence, and the corrupt interrogations. The judge famously declared that no sane human being could find these men guilty and officially vacated the convictions of Williams and Dick. Tice's conviction had previously been overturned in 2009 during earlier appeals. The final definitive stroke of justice occurred in March 2017. Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe granted absolute pardons to all 4 men: Eric Wilson, Daniel Williams, Joseph Dick, and Derek Tice. The absolute pardons declared the men definitively innocent, wiped their criminal records clean, fully reinstated their civil rights, and permanently removed them from the sex offender registry. These pardons closed the final chapter on a grave injustice that has plagued these 4 men for nearly 20 years, Governor McAuliffe's office stated. Following their criminal exoneration, the men filed federal civil rights lawsuits against the city of Norfolk and the police detectives who had destroyed their lives. In late 2018, a massive global settlement was reached. The city of Norfolk agreed to pay $4.9 million to the 4 men, and the state of Virginia contributed an additional $3.5 million, bringing the total compensation to $8.4 million. The settlement documents noted the egregious misconduct by police, including the withholding of exculpatory evidence, concealing Ballard's initial solo confession, and providing redacted reports to defense attorneys during the original trials. The fall of Robert Glenn Ford and the legacy of the case. As the Norfolk Four finally began to rebuild their lives, the architect of their misery faced his own reckoning. Detective Robert Glenn Ford's history of corruption eventually caught up with him. In May 2010, Ford was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges completely unrelated to the Bosco case. He was charged with extortion and lying to the FBI, accused of taking money from criminal suspects in exchange for favorable treatment. In late 2010, Ford was found guilty of 2 counts of extortion and 1 count of making false statements to federal agents, cementing his legacy as a corrupt and manipulative law enforcement officer. A confidential witness even came forward during the appeals process, claiming that Ford privately admitted he knew the Norfolk Four were innocent all along. Today, the Norfolk Four case remains a cornerstone of American legal studies, frequently cited in law schools and criminal justice academies as the ultimate cautionary tale regarding the Reed technique of interrogation, the dangers of prosecutorial tunnel vision, and the devastating power of the false confession. While Eric Wilson, Daniel Williams, Joseph Dick, and Derek Tice eventually won their freedom, their names cleared and their bank accounts compensated, nothing could truly restore the 2 decades of youth, freedom, and dignity stolen from them. In the dark, windowless interrogation rooms of the Norfolk Police Department,